You all are amazing stars advocates in your workplaces, and I appreciate your being here and having this conversation with us. I just want to first ask you to introduce yourselves and say a bit about who you are.
Sure, I can start. So my name's Candice Morgan. I am the head of inclusion and diversity at Pinterest. I've been working in the field of inclusion and diversity for over a decade. Started with consulting for about 10 years, working with lots of Fortune 1000 companies, and it's been quite a ride coming over to tech in the last couple of years.
Awesome.
So I'm Danny Allen. I'm responsible for tech diversity, specifically in the Silicon Valley, but across all board areas of the company. My focus is on 4 demographics that are in disparity within the tech industry, and SAP, of course, not being any different. In alphabetical order, African American, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islanders. And from my background, I've really been in development all of my career, from network and security engineering, cloud engineering, DevOps. And so I've been in this role for 18 months and still have a lot to learn.
Awesome.
So I'm Candi, Castleberry, Singleton. I'm the Vice President of Intersectionality, Culture, and Diversity at Twitter. I've been in my role 96 days. In business days, that means 62. So everything I'm saying to you, I'm just making up as we go along. Except the PR team wouldn't allow me to do that, so I'll have to be serious. My background is sales and marketing. I've been in I&D for about 18 years. I'm glad to be back in tech. Started my tech diversity work at Sun Microsystems when it was Sun before Oracle. I'm happy to be here today, happy to be back in the Bay, and honored to be sitting here with my colleagues.
Awesome. All right. Let's get real and talk about what's really holding the tech industry back. Why aren't we moving those numbers as fast as we might all want to, and what's really going on?
You want me to take that?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's a matter of mindset. It's a mindset based upon affinity. People are comfortable with those that are like them, that come from the same place, whether it's a school or a community. And I think ultimately, if you look at all the things that it boils down to, it's, think about all the people coming into the business. How were they funded? They usually come in through startups. So they're funded, they have some success or massive failure, and then they get adopted into some other organization and they move up the chain. If you think of the disparities, it's not the same situation. You can't get money. If you're a woman entrepreneur, no matter how good you are, how much experience you have, it's going to be hard for you to get cash. And if you can't get cash for your business and you can't prove yourself in terms of your ideas, it makes it difficult for anybody else to look at you as breaking this glass ceiling. And so I think it's really a mindset and affinity issue.
I would just add that oftentimes the absence of diversity has more to do with favoritism than it does discrimination. Clearly discrimination exists in the world, but even if I asked you all in the audience to name 5 friends that you bring with you into the workplace, you can think about then what your personal contribution would be. And those behaviors get perpetuated in everything we do. So they're not unique to tech. And I think we have to change the mindset in addition to thinking about the practices and policies that you put in place within an organization. And quite frankly, I think tech has to be more committed to working together to solve the pipeline issue. It's not going to be solved by one organization doing one thing and another organization doing another thing. And so you have lots of amazing ingredients, but they're not making a diverse pie at the end of the day. And so we're then all sort of having our battle over, who can get the greatest, fair share of what's available. So I think there has to be systemic agreement and practices that actually help us to build the pipeline. I think there has to be greater collaboration someplace along that line. And ultimately, we have to change the mindsets, and each of us who make a decision every day have to think about the decisions that we make and how inclusive we're being as individuals, so that it's not just the people who have the roles, it's the managers, it's people who make recommendations for their friends in the workplace, referrals, it's the decisions and the practices and the policies within the organization, it's the decisions you make as to who you put in your marketing campaigns and who you send on recruiting. I mean, it's a systemic opportunity for us to get better. It's not just the hiring, which sometimes I think people think if you solve the hiring thing, that you've solved the problem, and it actually is a whole problem that we also have to look at. So we have to think about it holistically, and it has to be everybody's job.
You know, I completely agree with my colleagues here. In fact, the one piece that I would add to it is just building off of what you both said. So yes, we talk a lot about hiring. We talk a lot about who gets a fair shot to come into the industry, and there's a lot that we need to change around that. But there are so many people decisions that leaders and managers are making once people are within companies, who we promote, who we give the hot jobs, who we give the assignments to that perpetuate the industry as is. So if you're making a big product change, you're gonna say, okay, who was a founder? Let's get these people. You know, there's a lot of perpetuating and building on the systemic issues that already are there. Also, the things that we need to do to break through require people to get really uncomfortable. And what do people like to do? We like things that we're familiar with, and we like to stay comfortable. We're almost always trying to get things back to comfortable. So we have to make all of these unconscious decisions that perpetuate the homogeneity of the industry conscious, which means talking about the hiring bar and talking about what success looks like and how we promote people, and kind of dissecting it in ways that we didn't have to do before.
Yeah. Danny, how long have you been in Silicon Valley?
Wow. Now, since 1902, 30 plus years.
So what have you seen in terms of the change in demographics in tech and kind of what's been happening around diversity and inclusion in tech since then?
So looking back, especially at the early part when we were talking about secure waste and all the stuff before SSL, the HTTPS stuff came into play. The U.S. government, defense industries used to be the primary funder for all the technology. And a lot of things that came out of NIST, or the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, a lot of stuff that got declassified had government funding behind it. When the government started pulling back, you started into this venture capital side of it, and the venture capitalists came in and fundamentally changed things. When I first came in, there were people of color in senior leadership roles in HP and Sun, SGI. We were just talking about that a little while ago.
Not 1902. We were talking about
Just so we're clear.
1903. All right. So, but there were people in significant roles, and that wasn't just tech. That was across the board. Silicon Valley has never been completely inclusive, but it is less inclusive now than it has been. There are less people, and there's a, if I may, there's a report that anybody can look at, and it's called The Illusion of Asian Success. If 46% of the workforce is Asian, why don't you have higher numbers in management or in executive ranks? But ultimately, it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot in the sense that we have more of a backlash against diversity, and we have more funding, like I said, for those tech startups, coming from people who only want to see people like them, or only trust people like them. So yeah, it's gotten worse.
Candice, you've been doing this work for quite a while as a consultant, and then relatively new in the tech industry, but you've been doing this diversity and inclusion work for quite a while. How do you create that change internally? You've been now at Pinterest for
Heading on 2 years.
2 years, yeah, yeah. So what have you done in 2 years to kind of help really develop that inclusive mindset and that real shift in culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it started before I actually got to Pinterest. And when I was deciding, after a decade of doing this consulting that I wanted to go into a company. I wanted to see long-term what all the challenges were. And I wanted to do it not in a conference room with some CEOs coming up with a strategy. I wanted to live those challenges and integrate it with a business strategy. But when I was choosing where to go, I knew I needed to go to a company where the CEO was already committed, because that's something that is very difficult to overcome if you don't already have that environment. And so the reason I chose Pinterest is because the company had set public goals around diversifying the workforce, which to me was really, really bold. I hadn't seen that in many, many years. But what we did in that first year to increase diversity were a lot of programmatic and structural changes. One of the things I'm proud of on the hiring side is that instead of just working on stealing talent from other companies and saying, hey, we're slightly better because we offer more perks, Candi's point, we started our apprenticeship program. And so we started hiring people who don't have a formal computer science degree, maybe taught themselves to code, maybe don't have a degree. And the program has been incredibly successful because we restructured how certain engineers were working to spend up to 50% of their time upskilling those apprentices for a whole year. And so they've all converted, and we've doubled the program. That's something that requires a lot of commitment. That's something that requires headcount conversations with the engineering leadership. So it's deep. But once they saw the results, they became more committed. I feel like, same thing with our leadership decisions. So now I'm sitting there with our executive team, and I am literally making all of the, helping them make all of their people decisions. And that's really important as well. They know that I'm sitting there, but they also can make their own connections about if they're being inconsistent. One of the things that I would say this year is a major challenge, though, is structural changes only go so much at the leadership level. So I've spent a lot of time working with our executive team. I've spent a lot of time working with one level below, but scaling this to managers is a point where that's where we often get stalled. That's where we get really stuck, because how do you make this the part of their everyday jobs? By the way, if you check out the Change Catalyst YouTube channel, there's a live stream of this going on. So, a little bit of a plug. But I really think that coming into a company where leadership is committed, coming to a company where engineering leaders are asking me how they can make changes, has been really key to moving our metrics the way we have in the first year. Is that going to continue in the second year? Not without them changing the mindsets of their managers.
Yeah, that's definitely the management level is really the next wave of change needed, and really developing that buy-in, developing that empathy at the management level, and really that understanding of creating change at that level, I think, is what we're seeing consistently too. Yeah. So Candi, in your new position, you're looking at Twitter and creating change in that company that really affects a lot of our lives. How are you looking at creating change in the company?
I think if you start even with just the title of intersectionality, to try to sort of take this on and help people to understand the context of building diverse networks and relationships is why we are actually including intersectionality as a part of our journey. And it is more about helping people who have traditionally operated in lanes where they're comfortable with people who are like them, and helping our employees first to begin to think about things that we have in common with others, rather than thinking of just the thing that I can see, right? In 1902, they used to call this, the iceberg, right? The things that you can see above the iceberg, and the things you don't know about people below the iceberg. And one of the things that we find is that we actually are more alike, if I can steal Dr. Maya Angelou's quote, that we're actually more alike than we're unalike. And oftentimes the ways that we're unalike are the things that we can see. The things that we find that we have in common are the things that we can't, but if we're not willing to build those deeper connections or have a greater interest in people beyond that which we can see, then we don't actually really expand our networks. And if we don't expand our networks and we continue to go back to our networks, to the people who we feel comfortable with, and we don't diversify the organization. And then if we don't diversify the organization, then we keep on doing this same work over and over and over again. So it really is going back to the basics. Some of the things that, if we don't do the basics, then we're just continuing to repeat the cycle of going over to Pinterest to get a few people and then going over to SAP to get a few people, as opposed to looking out into this audience and saying, how can you help? And if we really want it to sustain, we actually have to get everybody in this room to feel like it's a part of their role. Yeah. And if they don't see it as a part of their role and they only see it as a part of ours, then you're left with sort of these things that say, let's just move the Rubik's Cube around. There's no new people coming into the Rubik's Cube. We're just moving the orange to the green to the purple, you know. There isn't purple in the Rubik's Cube. So.
It's a new Rubik's Cube.
To the blue, right?
That was in 1902.
Right, but you get the point, right? So I think our journey really is beginning with getting people to make deeper connections with each other, in addition to the very traditional kinds of things that you'd expect in a diversity strategy, which would include, executive accountability and building a diverse pipeline and having diverse slates, all the kinds of things that you would expect. But if we don't change the actual behavior of people in the workforce, then you're just building practices that exist only as long as you're there to enforce those practices. And the biggest failure, I think, of the diversity industry is these diversity starts and stops. So the person who is there before you, right, leaves, and nothing happens, and people are like, well, we were waiting until you to come. So we didn't do anything while you were gone, right, while there was a gap, and then that next person comes, and then they say, tell us what to do. And then when that person leaves, they stop. Then the next person comes, and it's like most of the time, and this is something that we as practitioners should learn to be better at building on what exists versus going in a different direction, because every time, it would be like starting a new product every single time you get a new leader, and you don't actually build on that which has been successful in the past. And so, as a result, many organizations have sort of this thing, diversity starts and stops, based on who's there. Leaders change, people change, and so we stop until we get the next person. And so I think it's those kinds of things we need to also try to begin to avoid.
Yeah, and can I just say that the tell us what to do dynamic, like I'm sure I'm looking at Candi, I'm looking at Danny, and you're smiling at me. There is so much of that expectation. Like, tell me the secret sauce, tell me the 5 steps, and that's really dangerous because a lot of our executives are waiting for us to fix the problem when we cannot influence their managers, we cannot influence the business decisions, we cannot influence the product decisions. They have to own it. And so there's a lot of almost building up their creativity around this problem and making it less simplistic. That is a lot like what we're trying to break through this year.
Right.
Danny, SAP has been around for a while.
40 some years.
Yeah. So you're in a bit of a different position where you're in a company that has this tenure. How are you approaching developing a more inclusive environment?
So there's 3 specific areas that I think all of us have a challenge with, and I break them down into sourcing, development, and retention. And in the sourcing side, there's the outreach, there's the recruiting, and there's the onboarding. So that's sourcing the talent. On the development side, which is the one, we always talk about numbers, bringing so many people into the company. And you bring them in and you don't embrace their difference, you destroy not only your reputation and the benefit that you could have gotten from their diversity, you destroy these people's lives because they come in and they, like you were showing on one of the slides, women leaving quickly. So you have to figure out a way to get them engaged. And this development section is one of the areas that I'm focusing heavily on. Giving them a chance to talk to senior management. I have a thing called the Cultural Experience Exchange, where I get small groups of people, multi-generation, multi-gender, multi-ethnic, all the multis. So multi. But you bring them in and you have a couple of executives, and it's generally hard to find a female executive, and so I try very hard to have a female executive in there. And you just want people to express how they feel. So just having that basic exchange gives the executives a chance to hear something that they're like, oh, I thought everything was okay, I didn't realize. So awareness. And giving people voice, I think that's really critical. And then giving them areas in which they can develop toward their leadership side. Doing a good job in the sourcing and the development piece is how you impact retention. You'll have a high attrition rate for people who don't feel welcome, and you'll have a high attrition rate when the managers won't give them a challenge because they think negatively of them. So it's really this proximity thing, giving them a chance, whether people coming in on internships or rotational programs or more mature hires, giving them a chance to be engaged and let the senior people hear from the people in the trenches so that it can make a difference. But that's generically how we're doing it, and we're doing that across the board, even for neurodiversity.
Awesome, awesome. We only have a couple more minutes, and I want to just allow you three to seed the conversations moving forward in the conference. What is something that we aren't talking about in tech that we need to be talking about around this subject?
So one thing that I think is really important is we tend to have what I call healthy skepticism and unhealthy skepticism. I mean, I think the fact that the numbers are where they are, the fact that people who have a different experience don't feel as comfortable at companies, that's healthy skepticism. I think, though, unfortunately, sometimes we say, okay, well, these numbers haven't changed, this hasn't been done, this company doesn't care. And it's incredibly discouraging for some companies to even try, because they're like, I can just stay out of the whole conversation. I don't have to put my stake in the game. And so I feel like that's really important, that a lot of things that we're trying, some of them work and some of them don't, but it doesn't mean that we're not trying or that we're not going to unlock something that works later down the line. And frankly, I've heard CEOs say, like, you know what, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Like, you know, you can get panned for saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And honestly, that's on them in a lot of cases, I will say. But just know that there are many people that are waking in the middle of the night, going to bed, waking up in the morning, thinking about how to crack this and do better.
And you're talking about the shaming and the kind of naming and really publicly criticizing.
I think there's a place for public accountability. That's actually why we published public goals, because we knew it would kind of kick our butts, and that was part of the impetus. And so we're actually using that public accountability. So that's good. But I think that when we kind of hunt people down and say, okay, you obviously don't care because this thing failed, it can discourage other leaders. I think that there are many leaders who will never be discouraged, and I am one of them. But I do think that we have to have a healthy dialogue.
Awesome. Danny?
I think generically we're not talking about the financial success of the companies that are focused on an equity model, that are very inclusive. We talk a lot about the negative. We don't talk enough about the positive.
First, my handle, if you're actually tweeting at me, is @Candi, C-A-N-D-I. That actually is my name, CC Singleton, but that's not my handle.
Sorry about that.
I would say, no worries. I just want to make sure that if you're adding me, that I get the message versus CC Singleton. So I would say this, and I'd ask you just to think about this yourself, right? So if I asked you to bring 5 of your friends with you tomorrow to this event, these are people who actually consider you to be a friend too, not like somebody who you can name, right? Would your contribution to this room make the room more or less diverse? Meaning that you'd bring people who are different from you or only people like you. I think the challenge is, in some cases, and the thing that we don't talk about much, is what your role is in this, what everyone's role is in this. And sometimes people think that chief diversity officers, heads of diversities, have all the books of answers. And the reality is that I really often say that our title should be the chief everything officer, because people think we know everything about every demographic, every faith, every form of ability, every LGBTQIA++. They think we know everything. The reason we know these things is because we've demonstrated a commitment to try to learn about these things to help other people learn from it. And simply because we have a title doesn't mean that we know everything. The reason that we are in these roles is because we have networks, We leverage our friends. We do enough research. We spend time in this. There's not a book that you can read and become the Chief Diversity Officer. Oftentimes, the people who are most successful in this role are people who've actually been committed to learning about others. And by the way, that's not limited to just us. So when the world accepts that we're not the chief everything officer, when you put a demographic on something, it becomes our job. That same job, without the word diversity in front of it, belongs to somebody else. But you put diversity recruiting in front of it, then what's the answer? You put diversity marketing in front of it, multicultural, and what's the answer? The reality is the most effective way that organizations are going to sustain this work is if they recognize that their work is this work. And their work is marketing, is multicultural marketing. And their work in in recruiting is diversity. And their work in hiring is diversity. And their work in marketing is diversity. Their work is all of our work. And until we get to a place where we can acknowledge that this work belongs to all of us and not just us, we are going to be continuing to have this conversation when you get to be the age that some of us are sitting on this stage, right? So I would say to you, do your part. This isn't something that belongs to us. It belongs to all of us. And I'm not sure that we as practitioners have done the most successful job in creating shared accountability with each of you. So do your part. You've been given this day to use as you will. You can waste it or use it for good. When tomorrow comes, this day will be gone forever. And in its place are the decisions you left behind. May they be ones that make this world more inclusive, make your work more inclusive, and actually that make this conference a success.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Well, thank you, all three of you. This is hard work. This is emotional work. There's a lot going on in the world, and appreciate your dedicating your lives and work to this. Thank you.
Thank you.